Hello, today we will be demonstrating a domain in PV/PVC managed by the WebLogic Kubernetes Operator. Once the domain is in running state, we will describe how to make a topology change to the domain configuration by adding a new cluster to that domain. So we are going to be using the WebLogic Deploy Tooling to create the domain in the first place in the PV and PVC in Kubernetes. And then we will use, again, the WebLogic Deploy Tooling to modify that domain configuration to add that second cluster. You will see during the demo, create the domain using WDT in the PV/PVC. Then we will shut down that domain. We will update the domain configuration on the PV using WebLogic Deploy Tooling. And then we will edit the domain YAML to add cluster 2 and set the start policy back to if needed so that the domain is restarted by the operator.
So I'm going to install the operator. I have a script to do that. So this is going to invoke the Helm chart for the operator. So the operator should be running now. Unless OP, this is the operator that I just started. Let's see if it's running right now. Okay, so the operator is not ready yet. Okay, so it's running now. So I then want to start a domain. So I'm going to go. So that's created a credentials for the WLS domain in the namespace WLS domain nest. So I'm going to create a PV/PVC. So I have the input file, input YAML file for this already. So that's the domain we just created the credentials for. That's a namespace. And I have the PV in a WLS DOM test. Okay, so mine is okay. So it created the PV and PVC. Now we can go create the domain. We are doing the domain home on PV sample. So I have a input YAML file for that already. So the domain ID is WLS DOM, and this is the domain home inside the container. And we have one cluster. It's a dynamic cluster, cluster 1. And so we're going to be using WDT to create the domain. So that should create the domain for us. Okay, so let's check that the domain is running. Okay, so the domain is running. Make sure all the Pods are up. Not up yet. The managed servers are still yet to come up. Okay, so all the 3 servers are up and running. So now we can shut down the domain so we can add another cluster. Okay, so we want to change the policy to never to shut down the domain. Okay. So let's make sure that the domain is, that the servers are down. Okay, so the servers are all down. Now we want to add another dynamic cluster. So I have a model file which looks like this. So the admin user password, and then we're adding a cluster 2. We want to do calculated listen ports to be false because we want everything to come up on 8001 inside the container. That's the cluster template. So I have WLS installed already, and I also have downloaded the WDT WebLogic Deploy tool. So this is where I installed WDT. So I call the update domain.sh. It's going to update the domain with the second cluster. And this is where I have Oracle installed, WebLogic 12213 installed. And the domain type we're using is WLS. And this is where my domain home is created. Okay. So it updated the domain. We can check to see if the config XML is updated. So the cluster 2 is added now. The config XML. So now we have to go to the domain and update the domain YAML file. So okay. So we have to add the second cluster. So just go. Oh, okay. So we added the second cluster, and we also need to change the start policy to if needed. Okay. So now it should start the domain with the second cluster. Okay, the introspect job is running. Admin server is starting up. Okay, so this is the second servers belonging to the second cluster. So all the servers are now running, and these two belong to the second cluster. So we have the second cluster IP also created. Now we have added a second dynamic server to the domain, to an existing domain using WDT.